morning Harlan Voss walked into the hospital boardroom and fired his own wife. He was wearing the cufflinks she had given him on their 5th anniversary. She had picked them out herself, small gold rectangles engraved with his initials, the kind of detail he never would have noticed, but somehow always made him look put together at important meetings. He didn't know that. He didn't know a lot of things. Camille Voss, 36 years old, sat at the far end of the conference table in a charcoal blazer and said nothing when he handed the termination papers across the polished wood. Her name on the document read Camille Renard, the name she had worked under since before she and Harlan had ever met. The name on the door of the foundation she had built from nothing. The name that appeared in the hospital's founding charter in letters none of the people in that room had ever thought to read carefully enough. Harlan didn't look at her face when he slid the folder over. He was too busy looking at the woman standing behind his right shoulder, Tessa Crane, 41, his attorney. And, for the past 14 months, the reason Camille had stopped expecting him home for dinner. She picked up the folder. She read every line. Then she set it back down and said quietly, "I'll need 72 hours. That was the last thing she said to him in that room. What nobody in that boardroom understood, not Harlan, not Tessa Crane, not Harlan's father Sterling Voss, who had been maneuvering behind the scenes for the better part of a year, was that Camille had not come to that hospital as an employee. She had come as the person who owned it. Not on paper, not in any way that Harlan, who had never once asked her about her work with any genuine curiosity, would have thought to check. He knew she ran a non-profit. He knew she spent long hours on the phone with people whose names he didn't recognize. He knew she traveled, sometimes for weeks at a time, to cities she mentioned in passing, Memphis, Baltimore, Louisville, and that she always came back quieter than when she left, with a particular kind of tiredness that sat behind her eyes and not on her face. He had decided, somewhere in the 2nd year of their marriage, that her work was admirable but small. The kind of thing a woman did when she cared about people, but didn't have real power. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Camille Renard had grown up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the daughter of a woman who worked the overnight shift at a hospital laundry facility and a father who drove a delivery truck until his back gave out when Camille was 11. She had watched her mother navigate a healthcare system that treated patients like inconveniences and workers like furniture, and she had decided before she was old enough to vote that she was going to do something about it. She had a mind for numbers that her high school math teacher described as unsettling and a patience for long-term strategy that her college roommate described as honestly a little frightening. By the time she was 26, she had completed an MBA from Vanderbilt, taken a position at a healthcare investment firm in Nashville, and quietly begun acquiring distressed hospital assets in underserved communities across the Southeast. She did it under the name of her foundation, the Renard Health Collective, which most people in the industry knew as a philanthropic organization. What most people did not know was that the foundation was structured as a hybrid entity with a private investment arm, and that Camille personally controlled a portfolio of 11 regional hospitals, 3 urgent care networks, and a logistics company that supplied medical equipment to rural clinics in 6 states. She was, by any reasonable measure, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 million. She had never told Harlan. Not because she was hiding it from him exactly. In the beginning, she had simply been private about her finances the way she was private about most things. She had been that way since childhood, had learned early that announcing what you had made people want to take it. She'd planned to tell him when it felt right. But then the years passed, and she realized the window she'd been waiting for had never really opened, because Harlan had never asked. He had never sat across from her at dinner and said, "So tell me about what you actually do." He had never followed up on a project she mentioned. He had asked once how her foundation was holding up financially, and when she said it was doing well, he had nodded, and moved on to a story about something that had happened at his father's investment firm, where Harlan served as a managing partner in the kind of position that looks impressive from the outside, and from the inside involves a great deal of delegating to people who actually understand the work. She had loved him anyway. She had loved him in the particular way that smart women sometimes love men who are charming and confident, and not quite as capable as they believe themselves to be, with her eyes open, with genuine affection, and with a persistent, patient hope that he would grow into the person she could see he had the potential to be. He never did. The first sign that something was wrong arrived in the form of a missed call. It was a Thursday evening in February, and Camille had come home early from a trip to Memphis to find the house quiet, and Harlan's jacket thrown over the back of the kitchen chair in the particular careless way that meant he'd been in a hurry. His phone was on the counter. It buzzed once, and the name on the screen was Tessa with a small heart emoji beside it. Camille looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she walked upstairs and changed her clothes and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table until Harlan came home 2 hours later, smelling of a restaurant she recognized and a perfume she didn't. She didn't ask him about it that night. She didn't ask him about it the next day either, or the day after that. Instead, she did what she had always done when faced with a problem she didn't yet have enough information to address. She watched, and she waited, and she started to understand. She understood that the missed calls were not occasional. She understood that Tessa Crane had been his attorney for 3 years and had at some point in the last 18 months become something else. She understood that Harlan's father Sterling, a man who had never liked Camille, who had introduced her at the first family dinner as Harlan's charity worker, had recently begun taking meetings with Tessa at his office. She understood, with a clarity that came slowly, and then all at once, that the three of them were planning something. She just didn't know what yet. The answer came in April, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Camille's attorney and close friend of 12 years, a woman named Frances Burke, called her from a parking garage in downtown Nashville and spoke in the careful, lowered voice of someone who has just seen something they can't unsee. "Camille," Frances said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Frances had been at a deposition that morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building where Sterling Voss's firm kept its offices. She hadn't been there for anything related to Camille. She was representing a separate client in a commercial dispute. But she had arrived early and been shown to a waiting area adjacent to a glass-walled meeting room, where the blinds were only partially drawn. She had seen Harlan. She had seen Tessa Crane. She had seen Sterling. And she had seen, spread across the table between them, a set of documents that included what appeared to be a property transfer agreement, a divorce filing, and a document she recognized. Because she had reviewed similar instruments in her own practice, as a petition for involuntary removal of a foundation director. They weren't just ending the marriage. They were trying to take the foundation. Camille didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote out everything she knew, everything she suspected, and everything she needed to confirm. By morning, the legal pad had 12 pages of notes, and the yellow had gone almost translucent where her pen had pressed hardest. She called Frances back at 7 a.m. and said 3 things. She said, "I need to know exactly what they've filed and when." She said, "I need to know if Harlan has any idea what the foundation actually is." And she said, "I need you to tell me honestly whether what they're doing can work." Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Legally? No, not even close. But Camille, the fact that they tried tells you something." It told Camille something she had been refusing to acknowledge for a long time. Not just that Harlan had been unfaithful. Not just that he had been planning to leave her, but that he had sat across from her at 1,000 meals and 1,000 evenings and 1,000 ordinary days, and had looked at her and seen something smaller than what she was, and had never once been curious enough to look harder. She had grieved a lot of things in her life. She was not going to grieve this. She gave them the 72 hours she had promised. During those 72 hours, she did not go home. She stayed at the apartment she kept in Nashville. The apartment Harlan did not know about. Because he had never asked where she stayed when her work kept her in the city, and she worked with Frances and with the foundation's board of directors, who gathered on a video call within hours of being briefed and responded with the unanimity of people who have spent years watching a leader build something worth protecting. What they found, when Frances's team completed their review of the documents Harlan and Sterling and Tessa had prepared, was that the petition for director removal was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. The filing cited Camille's non-profit status and argued that the foundation's assets were subject to a claim under a provision of Tennessee law regarding marital property. There was one significant problem. The foundation's private investment arm, the entity that actually held the hospital assets, the urgent care networks, the logistics company, the $400 million, was not organized in Tennessee. It was organized in Delaware, under a structure that Frances had helped Camille design 8 years earlier, specifically to insulate the foundation's operational assets from exactly this kind of claim. The Tennessee filing had no jurisdiction over it. The petition was, in the language Frances used when she called Harlan's attorney to explain this, not just defective, it's embarrassing. Tessa Crane did not respond for 6 hours. When she finally called back, she asked to speak with Camille directly. Camille declined. The board meeting at Mercy Regional, the hospital where Harlan had walked in and fired her, took place 10 days later. Camille arrived in the same charcoal blazer. She sat in the same chair at the far end of the table. She placed in front of every board member a bound document that Francis's team had prepared, a complete disclosure of the Renard Health Collective's ownership structure, its asset portfolio, and its founding charter, which included a provision that the board had apparently never read closely, a provision that identified the foundation's managing director as the hospital's majority stakeholder with veto authority over executive appointments and terminations, including the termination that had been issued 10 days ago, including the termination that had been signed with the same cufflink-wearing hands by Harlan Voss, who had never been, and had no authority to act as an officer of the hospital in any capacity. The board chair, a man named Dr. Aldous Prentice, who had been in his position for 11 years and had seen a remarkable number of strange things, looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Camille. Then he looked at the document again. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Renard," she said. "Please." He nodded once. "Miss Renard, I want to be very clear about something. Are you telling us that the termination Mr. Voss issued was void?" Francis said from her seat beside Camille. "From the moment it was signed." Dr. Prentice set the document down on the table with the careful movements of someone handling something that had suddenly become very significant. "And Mr. Voss's authority to enter this building and conduct that meeting?" "Also void," Francis said. The room was very quiet. What happened next did not involve Camille raising her voice. It did not involve threats. It involved a formal letter from the Renard Health Collective's legal team, delivered simultaneously to Harlan Voss, Sterling Voss, and Tessa Crane, informing them that the Foundation was initiating a review of all interactions with hospital facilities over the preceding 18 months, with particular attention to any instances of unauthorized access, unauthorized representation, or attempted interference with the Foundation's governance structure. It also informed Harlan, specifically, that the divorce filing he had initiated would be proceeding. Camille had no objection to that, but that his attorneys should be aware of the Delaware structure before making any claims about marital assets, because the conversation they were hoping to have was not the conversation they were going to get. Sterling Voss called Camille's cell phone 3 times in the 48 hours after the letter was delivered. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail on the 3rd call. She listened to it once, standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter. He said he wanted to explain. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said that Harlan, and here his voice had something in it that might have been genuine, which was somehow the most surprising thing, Harlan hadn't known about any of it, about what the Foundation actually was, about the Delaware structure, about the asset portfolio. He genuinely had no idea, Sterling said on the voicemail with what sounded almost like exhaustion. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse." Camille set the phone down on the counter beside the coffee. She thought about that for a while. The divorce was finalized in the fall, 7 months after the board meeting at Mercy Regional. It was uncomplicated in the end. Harlan's attorneys had reviewed the Delaware structure and concluded correctly that there was nothing there to claim. The marital assets, the house in Brentwood, the investment accounts in both their names, a vacation property in Asheville that Camille had always liked more than he had, were divided cleanly without drama by 2 sets of lawyers in a conference room that neither Camille nor Harlan entered. She didn't see him in person after the day he had fired her. She heard about him, occasionally, through the quiet channels of a world in which everyone eventually knows everyone. She heard that Tessa Crane had ended their relationship 3 months after the Delaware letter, which was, Camille thought, the most predictable sentence she could have written about that situation. She heard that Sterling had withdrawn from 2 of his most prominent board positions, citing health reasons, in the same week that a business journal published a brief item about an unnamed Nashville investment firm under regulatory review for undisclosed conflicts of interest. She didn't look into it. She had other things to think about. In January, the Renard Health Collective broke ground on a new clinic in a town in rural Mississippi where the nearest emergency room was 43 miles away. Camille was there for the ceremony, standing on red clay earth in the thin winter light, watching a small crowd of people who had driven from 3 counties over because they wanted to see it happen. A woman standing next to her, maybe 60, maybe older, in a good coat that had been worn a long time, reached over and pressed her hand briefly without saying anything. Camille pressed back. On the flight home, she sat by the window and watched Tennessee come into view below her. All those small towns and winding rivers, and the particular patchwork of fields and tree lines that she had looked down at hundreds of times without quite seeing. She thought about her mother, who had worked the overnight laundry shift at a hospital that had eventually closed. She thought about Francis, who had answered a parking garage phone call without knowing she was about to change everything. She thought about the board chair, Dr. Prentice, who had said her name wrong and then corrected himself and moved on without making it a moment. She thought about Harlan once, briefly, not with anger, not with grief, but with the particular quiet that comes when something has been resolved. He had looked at her for 8 years and never seen what was there. That was a loss, she understood now. But it had not been her loss. She had built every piece of what she had with her own hands, with her own name, on her own terms. She had given him the cufflinks, and he had worn them to fire her, and none of it had been enough to touch what she actually was. The plane descended through a layer of clouds and came out the other side into a pale winter afternoon. And Camille Renard looked out the window at the city, coming up to Cheetah, and thought, the next clinic opens in March. There was a lot of work to do.